Well, thank you very much. A year ago, I was here speaking about North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, and we haven't solved that problem yet. But at the time, it was only a couple days or a day after North Korea's last nuclear test. And since Ben had scheduled the topic weeks in advance, I complimented him on his clairvoyance and also maybe raised some suspicions as to how he knew what was going to happen and whether he had some back-channel communications with Pyongyang in order to gin up attendance for the talk. And
I keep telling Frank that the Pyongyang CSP field office will pay off eventually, right. And I think it actually did.
Right. And as I talk about the same topic again today, we see articles, very prevalent in the media about North Korea doing yet another nuclear test. So whether they will do it or not really is like asking, will it rain? Of course, they will. Will they do another provocation? Of course, it's in the nature of the regime. It's always just a question of when. And so whether it'll be during Obama's trip or whether it'll be by the end of the month, really we're not sure. There's a lot of information coming out of, or actually intelligence leaks, coming out of the South Korean government that not only do they see increased activity at the nuclear test site, but also, they've heard chatter, presumably leaking signals intelligence information about North Korean officials talking about something big by the end of the month. So, and also independent U.S. imagery analysts have said that they've seen increased activity, though their assessment is perhaps not imminent, i.e. during the president's trip. But, as for, will it happen today, tomorrow? The answer is we don't know. We have to wait. And I'm reminded of, I do a number of radio interviews oftentimes at home, and my wife will listen in sometimes, and she'll say afterwards, you say, I don't know a lot, and yet they keep calling you. And I'll respond, it's like, yes, I say I don't know, but I say it with great authority. And so with North Korea, we can talk about the nuclear test perhaps in Q&A, but I think taking a step back, I think it's useful to point out is what we often see in all the articles about whether it was the upcoming nuclear test or the recent launch of 2 medium-range ballistic missiles is usually near the end they're sort of almost a throwaway line but experts assess that North Korea has not yet figured out how to weaponize or miniaturize their warheads, and they haven't yet figured out how to put it on top of a missile. So it's still several years away for them to have that capability. And so, whether it's a throwaway line or not, it does reflect what I think is sort of the predominant assessment by most experts, that North Korea, even though they've been working on this for decades and they've been pursuing this capability for decades, that they haven't yet figured it out for some reason. And I think that's a flawed analysis. I think that if you look even just at the unclassified imagery, there are a number of factors, I think, which lead us to believe that they have figured out how to weaponize it, as they have claimed, that they have figured out how to miniaturize it enough to put on their medium-range no-dong missiles, and that they have developed at least the preliminary capability of hitting the United States with a missile. Whether they've accomplished reentry vehicle technology or not, they haven't demonstrated it. But I think North Korea is much further along than the path than the media and perhaps a lot of the experts think. And the problem with having what I think is an overly benign or overly complacent assessment of North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities is that it leads the policymakers to presume that we still have several years to address the problem. We still have several more years to maybe implement more effective ballistic defense. We maybe have a couple more years to let what has really been a timid incrementalism policy of sanctions, try to take effect. We still have several more years to hope that North Korea comes back to negotiations in a meaningful way. And I think that also leads to a policy complacency. Now, whether it's kind of, I think, in many cases, sort of an ideologically driven analysis, not only within the government, but amongst those who would sort of be what I would call uber engagers, those who are eager for engagement, really with very little conditionality and trying to get back to the table without preparing the diplomatic battlefield, as it were. And it's just politically inconvenient. If you acknowledge officially what seems to be a closer threat than people think, then you have to do something. And it's far easier as a policymaker or a politician to just kick the can down the road and hopefully it blows up on the next guy's watch. So I think there's a problem with having what I think is a flawed assessment of the North Korean capability. So what I would assert is that the U.S. and its allies face a more dire threat in a more immediate time frame than perhaps is the school book solution or the prevalent view. It's also become quite clear under Kim Jong-un, the new, or no longer new, but young North Korean leader, that he is just as resistant to implementing political and economic reform as his predecessors, and he is just as resistant to moderating North Korea's aggressive, assertive foreign policy, including its threats or even attacks against South Korea. Sort of retroactively, he's been credited with being the mastermind behind the two acts of war, the two attacks on South Korea in 2010. He's been retroactively credited not only with last year's nuclear and missile tests, but even the previous tests in earlier years. So the rhetoric we've seen, the actions we've seen out of the regime clearly show that there's no change, no deviation from Kim Il-sung's and Kim Jong-il's policies. So I noticed yesterday or today, David Sanger, the New York Times, has an article about what we got wrong about Kim Jong-un, that the prevalent view was that Kim Jong-un would be a reformer, and this has proven to be wrong. And the prevalent view was that Kim Jong-un would pursue a better policy, and this was wrong. And then in his usual way, he sort of criticizes the straw man that he creates. Well, I know I'm not the only one who didn't, think Kim Jong-un was going to be any different. I mean, I remember in 1994 when the State Department predicted that Kim Jong-il was a bold economic reformer and North Korea was on the cusp of implementing massive economic reform. Well, we're still waiting. So I think, sort of this straw man now is that we got it wrong. Well, I don't think we did. I think it was pretty obvious right off the bat that Kim Jong-un would be just as dangerous, that he would continue these nuclear and missile programs. So the concern people have really is that he's perhaps even more dangerous than his father. It's the same policies, but it seems to be implemented sort of in a more brutal way, as we've seen with the execution of his uncle and the second most powerful man in North Korea, Chung Sung-taek, and literally the hundreds or thousands of officials who have been purged not only in the 2 years of his watch, but in the 2 years up to his the change of command. But also on foreign policy, what we saw last March and April, it seemed to be done in a more amateurish, a more erratic, a less predictable fashion. And certainly when you have a regime that's threatening to turn not only Seoul but Washington into a sea of fire, when they're threatening nuclear attacks against the United States and our allies, when they're making very specific tactical level attacks in the West Sea, the site of many deadly clashes between the Koreas, having someone we know less about and who seems to be less predictable and perhaps who doesn't understand the concepts of red lines like his father seemed to, that makes for a great deal of concern. We certainly saw that the tension level and concern was much higher last April. And if North Korea does do another test, there's going to be responses by the UN, by the U.S. and others. It's certainly going to, I think, lead North Korea to respond to those responses, which will generally play out as increased military threats. And then we have this cycle of concern going on again. If we look at the capabilities, it's always a best guess, but we think that North Korea likely has 6 to 8 plutonium-based nuclear weapons. Estimates vary, but that's sort of the mid-range. But what really, and that is largely capped, not by negotiations, but because that's the amount of fissile material they have from plutonium. They've restarted their nuclear reactor, they're expanding nuclear facilities, so that will eventually grow. But the area, I think, of concern on the nuclear issue is uranium. We know that in the late 1980s they began this parallel second path to augmenting their nuclear arsenal. It was dismissed by many analysts as just a creation of the Bush administration until it became so irrefutable that people could no longer deny it. And the concern is that the upcoming test And perhaps even the test a year ago was uranium-based. And the reason that would be important is it would demonstrate that North Korea has acquired that parallel second path. And the problem with uranium is it's much easier to conceal. You can have centrifuges in someone's basement as opposed to a large, easily detectable reprocessing and reactor facilities. So we don't know how many centrifuges they have. We don't know how many covert facilities with centrifuges. So if they demonstrate they have uranium, we really have no idea how many additional uranium-based weapons they have, as well as the production capability. So that really is one of the areas of concern. Some people think the test might be thermonuclear or a boosted fission device. That may be the case, but I think it's far more likely that it would be uranium. It's sort of the next logical step. And all of this is occurring at a time when the U.S. is slashing its defense budget. We saw even before the sequestration forced budget cuts that the Obama administration had cut $480 billion. And the Asia pivot is more rhetoric than reality. There have been no forces, no new permanent deployments identified going into the Pacific. None of the forces coming out of Iraq, Afghanistan, or Europe redeployed into the Pacific. And so even though the forces in the Pacific are fenced or really protected from being cut, they're not protected from the effects of reduced budget for training and deployments. What we've seen already is the Defense Department will say that 1 in 3 Air Force planes worldwide are grounded due to a lack of funding. Several ships, including at least 2 in the Pacific theater, aren't leaving port for planned training or deployments because of a lack of funding. The Marine Corps in the Pacific had their training cut. They, as one general pointed out, it's like driving your car when the engine warning light comes on. It's cheaper to ignore it. It doesn't necessarily mean you have an immediate crisis. You can drive some time for, with the warning light on, but eventually it's going to lead to a catastrophe, and it's going to be a lot more expensive to fix it when it becomes a catastrophe or a crisis than if you took care of it ahead of time. And that's sort of what the Marines in the Pacific are seeing. They also point to the fact that the obvious tyranny of distance in the very large Pacific theater of operations. You can't fly everything by plane. You need the amphibious ships. Now, the Marines had pointed out even years ago that to move the 3 Marine Expeditionary Brigades, the MEBs, they need 54 amphibious ships. Well, they didn't get them. So what happened, as is often the case in Washington, is we redefined downward our security requirements. In order to move 2 MEBs, maybe 38 ships. Well, the Marines aren't getting those. The budget was going to be 33. Now it looks like it's going to be below 30. So now what we've redefined it downward is maybe we only need to move 1.5 MEBs. Well, that's not a good idea when you have various crises or potential crises in the Pacific, and you're even moving the Marines further east as part of the Guam Agreement to move them away from Okinawa to Guam, and now the revised version to Hawaii, to the west coast of the United States. So you're moving them further away at a time when you're not building enough of the amphibious ships to get them back into the crisis area. So, overall, we have growing threats from North Korea, not to mention the Chinese threat, its increasing assertiveness against Japan and the Senkakus, as well as a number of smaller nations in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia down in the South China Sea. So we have growing crises at a time when not only are we decreasing our defense capabilities, but they're increasing questions worldwide about U.S. resolve. President Obama is on his Asia trip right now, and I think if he was a rock group and you were selling the T-shirts, they'd be labeled the Reassurance Tour. So he's going to Asia. He's trying to reassure Asia. Now, we also have U.S. officials going to Europe to reassure them that pulling 2 brigade combat teams earlier out of Europe didn't decrease our capability. So first the Europeans were nervous because of the Asia pivot, and then the Asian allies got nervous because they saw the impact of defense cuts, and now when we affirm our support for the European allies, the Asian allies are afraid we have a reverse Asia pivot, and at the same time you have Saudi Arabia and Israel who are nervous about and need reassurance about the possible impact of the Iran nuclear negotiations, which may leave Iran with more reprocessing capability or enrichment capability than the UN resolutions, which call for a total ban on enrichment. So the fact that so many countries worldwide need to be reassured, I think, reflects you know, sort of a fatal flaw in U.S. foreign policy. So I'll leave it there, with obviously on a depressing note, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce. And for the record, I don't think there's ever been a presentation that's ended here on a high note. It's almost always on a depressing note, so you're in good company. Let me just ask a quick question. To what extent is North Korea getting help from Pakistan on its nuclear program?
I'd say it was very extensive in the past. I'm not getting a sense of current cooperation. I think now that sort of role has been filled with Iran. But certainly, I mean, the North Korean nuclear missile programs are indigenous, but they are heavily reliant on funding, including from their illicit activities, and foreign material, expertise, components. And early on, we saw a very strong relationship between North Korea and Pakistan, or the rogue AQ-CON network, which I don't think was very rogue. You know, there's a lot of unclassified reporting about the interaction on missiles and nuclear. AQ-CON, in some of his debriefings, said that North Korean scientists helped them figure out how to put a warhead on a missile, and that the North Korean warheads were a thing of beauty and better than the Pakistan warheads. Now, the thing is that's interesting is experts on South Asia just without a doubt say, yes, Pakistan's a nuclear power. Yes, the Ghauri missile, the medium-range ballistic missile, is nuclear capable. It's got a warhead on it, no question at all. But when it comes to North Korea, there's like, well, they haven't figured it out. Well, the original Ghauri missiles were totally produced by North Korea. They're the no-dong missiles. They were produced 100% in North Korea, shipped to Pakistan. They gave them a local paint job and paraded them. Same with the Shahid-3 missiles in Iran. They were no-dong missiles, the first ones they paraded. And yet there's sort of this prevalent view of, well, Pakistan did it, but North Korea hasn't. So I think if you look cumulatively at the evidence, you know, I don't see why there would be a doubt in assuming North Korea hasn't put a warhead on the no-dong. But so I think Pakistan was more in the past, and certainly there's a relationship unknown to what degree on the nuclear front between North Korea and Iran.
Thank you. Other questions for Bruce? Yes, Pete. Can you wait for the mic?
Pete Knickerbocker, Let Freedom Ring. To what extent do we think the North Korean nuclear program includes, or maybe has as its major aim a surprise EMP attack on North America?
Like much of the North Korean nuclear program, we don't know. Again, playing to my wife's perception, I don't know anything about North Korea. There have been reports, you know, very sort of, you know, very just minor or little tidbits of information about, you know, EMP weapon or EMP strategy. Nothing really, I think, definitive about it. You know, you then sort of are debating what their strategy might be. You know, you would think if they're going to explode one over South Korea, that would affect them as well. Whether they would use one of their, you know, what's right now is still a handful of nuclear weapons in an EMP attack on the U.S., or whether it would, you know, keep them in reserve for a deterrent, we don't know. So it's actually a long-winded, I don't know.
Other questions? Yes, Joel.
What are you hearing lately about Iranian cooperation with North Korea on missile technology and nuclear technology?
Right. There's more information on missiles. We know for decades North Korea has been exporting missiles and cooperating with, you know, the list of rogue nations, Pakistan, Iran, Libya, et cetera. Regionally, on the missile front, it was North Korea was the master, or the teacher, and then over time it became more collaborative. And then, as we know, Iran put a satellite into orbit before North Korea did. So I think there's a much more integrated or collaborative effort on missiles. We've seen reports that Iranian scientists have been present at all the recent, you know, medium and long-range North Korean missile tests, perhaps at the nuclear test. So I think clearly there's this back and forth of exchange of technology and expertise, and there's reports that Iran paid, I believe, $500 million to support the North Korean missile program and perhaps the nuclear program, obviously in exchange for expertise and even components. The nuclear side, the information is just much more scarce. I think CRS just put out a report saying there's really no definitive evidence of collaboration with North Korea and Iran on nuclear front. I think the information is in the classified realm, and I think even on the unclassified side, I think there's enough indicators that, and it would make sense. The Syrian reactor that was bombed by Israel in September 2007, people initially denied it was a reactor. They initially denied that North Korea was involved. Clearly it became irrefutable. There were even some reports that it was like a trilateral project with Iran, Syria, and North Korea, that Iran perhaps may have been funding it, and that perhaps some of the fissile material was destined for Iran. But again, the information is pretty scarce, but I think it's safe to conclude that not only is there a missile relationship, but also a nuclear relationship.
Do we have one final question for, yes, Admiral Lyons?
You covered so much ground and we got so much trouble. And the one thing, the uncle was the main channel to Beijing, wasn't he?
He certainly seemed to be the main.
Who has picked up that role now, and what is the, let's say, the interface there that maybe keep the lid on?
Right now, China is perhaps even more unhappy with its troublesome ally than before. Chongsung Tech wasn't the only conduit between Pyongyang and Beijing, and I think some of that may have been overplayed, just as a lot of people said Chongsung Tech was a reformer. And after Chong's execution, I don't think there were a lot of volunteers to be the next second most powerful man in North Korea. I think that just means you're the next one on the gangplank. There's a vice marshal, Che, that seems to have assumed that role. But since the purge, China has been even more concerned about the activity. The problem is it hasn't led to increased Chinese pressure on North Korea or more full implementation of required sanctions and UN resolutions by Beijing. They still seem to be relying on the can't we all just get along, can't everyone just go back to the six-party talks, let's sort of drop these preconditions. So I think China is more in the dark than it was before about what's going on in North Korea. I think a lot of times people assume too much about what China knows or influences North Korea, but we haven't seen as much bilateral engagement between Pyongyang and Beijing, although the economic deals are still going through, and that's a vital lifeline for the regime.
They could withdraw those 16-wheel tells. That would send a very definite message.
Right. That was the UN Committee of Experts looked at that, and clearly the chassis were produced by Beijing. It's likely China knew what the end use was, but sort of no definitive proof that they were involved in producing the tail part, but clearly the chassis, and it's sort of obvious, I think, what they were going to be used for.